listener production.
Hey, Chris Spyrou with you. Welcome to this episode of The Briefing. It's almost been 950 days since Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine. And while in 2022 all eyes were on Kiev, it wasn't long before the war in Gaza dominated global headlines, and the Eastern European conflict seemed to slip out of our daily consciousness. But as the war wages on and reaches its 3-year mark in February, will there be anyone left to fight? Just last week, Putin ordered an increase of 180,000 troops to the regular Russian army. That would raise the total number of active soldiers to 1.5 million and the overall size of his military to 2.38 million. It's the third time since 2022 he's made an order like this, and it's a move that would make Russia's army the second largest in the world after China. As for Ukraine, they have a 900,000-person military that's seemingly reliant on a conscription campaign that ramped up in April this year when President Volodymyr Zelenskyy passed fresh laws to boost manpower. Joining me now is national security expert, author and journalist Misha Zelinsky, who's written about his time on the ground in Ukraine to find out more. Misha, thanks so much for joining us on The Briefing. Firstly, can you tell us a little bit about the laws Zelenskyy signed earlier this year and why it had to be passed?
It's in many ways unremarkable. You got to remember that Ukraine's in an existential war for its survival. This is not like a war that, if they sort of give up, things will be relatively okay for them. Like fundamentally, if Ukraine stops fighting, Ukraine will be conquered by Russia. So you need two things when you're fighting wars. You need weapons and warriors. And so we've heard a lot about the efforts of the Ukrainian government to get weapons from around the world, from Western countries, including Australia. And also you need soldiers to go do the fighting. And so we're 2.5 years now into a really brutal war. And so in many ways, it's not really surprising that both Ukraine and Russia are using conscription to bolster their force on the front line.
Do we have any numbers here to give us a bit of a picture of what we're looking at?
Both armies are probably measured around the million mark, if not more. Russia is clearly a bigger country than Ukraine, about 3 times the size, depending on how you measure, maybe 4 times. Ukraine's around 45 million, Russia's around 150, 160 million people. So when you look at the size of the armies and the type of fighting that you're seeing, the fighting is extraordinarily brutal. So in many ways, I describe it as a high-tech and a low-tech war. So high-tech, drone technology, cyber, all manner of new methods of war, and at the same time, very, very low-tech, almost like World War I style trench warfare fighting. And so a recent estimate just came out that 1 million casualties have occurred on both sides. Now, principally about 70% of those are on the Russian side in terms of deaths and wounded, and how you measure casualties is not just people who are KIA, killed in action. So, it's extraordinarily brutal. We haven't seen a war like this really since World War II, this level of casualty. And so, again, Ukraine being a smaller country than Russia requires more reinforcements on the front line. But there's still a huge number of soldiers engaged on both sides.
There have been several reports coming out that the average age of a soldier fighting for Ukraine is about 43, 45. Can you speak a little bit to that and why that might be the case?
The reason you're seeing the average age of both sides up is that I think young people are not wanting to fight. When you hear the stories of the brutality on the front line, it's not surprising in many ways. And one of the main things you need when you're encouraging people to fight in war, you need a purpose. Now, clearly, Ukraine has an existential purpose, as I mentioned before, but you also need a belief that you're going to win. I think one of the things that you're seeing on the Ukrainian side is there's a real fear that they're not having the weapons that they need. Now, there's a new bill signed by the United States and also by NATO allies to send more weapons to the front line. That's important because warriors without weapons are going to perish very quickly. But I think the sense that the casualty rate's very high, I think would be having an impact. Also, when you look at under the hood on the Ukrainian side in particular, Russians are clearly calling up criminals, we know. They are paying people to go fight as well. They also use conscription. But on the Ukrainian side, 12 million people got displaced at the beginning of the war. A lot of people, we don't know where they are. They haven't necessarily registered new addresses. Also, I think part of the challenge is that teenage children that left with their parents, or their mothers mainly, because men 18 to 60 were barred from leaving, they haven't returned home. And again, at a macro level, you could say, it's a bit selfish. You got to, your country's under attack. Perhaps you should go fight. But on a micro level, you can understand parents and mothers wanting to shield their children from that horrible fighting. So I think one of the critical things here is giving Ukrainians a sense that they can win. And that's why things like the Kursk incursion into Russian territory is so important, because that lifts morale. Napoleon said many, many centuries ago now, to quote Napoleon, but he said that morale counts for more than any other factor of war. Weapons, size of your army, morale is what you need the most. And I think Ukrainians' morale is the most important thing, and that's explains some of the things you're seeing on the front line.
What does it look like for a young man who's been conscripted to fight for Ukraine? What do the next 30, 40, 60 days look like for that person?
Well, you get training. So obviously your number, or you get called up, the conscription officers go and see you and tell you they've been conscripted and that you need to go assemble, whatever the site is that's in your local area. And then you go into basic training. Perhaps goes without saying, but the best training for war is war. And there's almost no amount of training that can make you ready for war. But what it does give you is the highest possibility or potentiality of survival in those first days until you actually work out what live ammunition fighting is all about. And you can understand that going very quickly from a young person being conscripted into fighting to training to the front line, you can imagine just how head spinning that would be and how shocking that would be. But that's essentially what it looks like.
With that being said, do you anticipate we will be seeing Ukraine running out of people to fight this war?
No. I think that'd be very difficult to imagine. When you talk about a country the size of 45 million people, there are people that have been evading conscription, but that's not uncommon. If you look at the history of conscription, it's always contentious. And so when you have conscription, for the reasons I mentioned before, people make the choice that they don't want to fight, whether they're conscientious objectors or frankly, they can be scared of fighting. They can evade. But the numbers you're seeing in terms of evasion, the numbers I've seen are estimated in the tens of thousands. You're talking about a country of 45 million. There's no shortage of courage in Ukraine. There's a shortage of weapons. And that's where I think it's incumbent on countries like Australia to send more weapons to give Ukraine the best chance of success on the battlefield.
Do you think the world is still watching and wanting to help Ukraine? You mentioned weapons supply there. Is global support faltering?
I think so, yeah. Unfortunately, it's not at the top of the list like it was in February, March, May, June of 2022. I was there. I felt like you're at the centre of the universe. The importance of this war has not gone away. It's, in fact, the most important conflict maybe in modern history, certainly for many, many, many decades now. And the history of this war has not really been written yet. We don't know what the lessons will be. We're only 2.5 years in, and we don't know how it will resolve itself. But if the resolution is that Russia conquers Ukraine, or that Vladimir Putin is able to get away with his invasion of Ukraine, of a democratic nation next door, simply because he doesn't like it, that's not going to be the end of it. And it won't be the end of it for Putin, but it will also embolden other dictators around the world. So it's very important for countries like Australia. We are a country of 25 million people. We're a democracy. Democracies are in the minority around the world. And so it is a very, very dangerous world. In fact, I would say that Australia cannot survive in a world where large countries destroy small countries simply because they don't like their system of government. If dictators can destroy democracies, Australia cannot survive in a world like that. So whether it's Australia, whether it's the United Kingdom, NATO, other allies, Japan, it's incumbent upon all of us to make sure that Ukraine wins. So if you sort of never want to see Australia ever have to fight a war in our neighbourhood, and I hope that never happens, the best thing we can do is to send weapons to be used in Ukraine to defeat Putin, because that is not charity, it's national security policy for Australia.
How much longer do you think this war can go on for? Do you see an end in sight?
Well, the problem you have is that both sides have determined that the fight is existential. Clearly for Ukraine, their choice is either keep fighting or be dominated by Vladimir Putin. I think they've made their choice very, very clear there. Putin's also said that he's not prepared to give up. So it comes down to which side's prepared to test its will the longest. Now, wars are typically fought by soldiers, but they're also contested by industrial bases. If we leave Ukraine on its own against Russia, Russia's a larger country with more people and a larger economy, and they will potentially grind them down over time. Now, at the battlefield right now, you're seeing Russia make very, very slow incremental gains in the south and the east. They're very, very costly for Russia right now, losing huge amounts of troops, huge amounts of ammunition and material. But gradually over time, they can grind away and try to force Ukraine into submission. Now, if the industrial base is not just Ukraine by itself, but NATO, the United States, Australia, or the Asian Pacific powers that are democratic together, then Russia's completely outmatched. And so an end to the war, what does it look like? I don't know. Fundamentally, how this war ends is up to the Ukrainians in terms of what they're most comfortable with. Now, they're saying they want to get all their land back. Russia currently controls 20% of their land mass, and that's fair enough. You can imagine from an Australian point of view, if we had international countries saying to Australia, hey, listen, just give up the state of Queensland, you don't need it. I'm not sure too many Australians would be persuaded by that argument because it's clearly a part of sovereign Australia. And so I think what peace looks like, we don't know, but we should give Ukraine the best opportunity to fight for its freedom on its terms. They're not asking us to do anything. They're not saying, come fight here. They're not saying, come die here. They say, we'll do the fighting. We'll do the dying. Give us the weapons we need. And there's no shortage of bravery there. They are taking it to one of the world's military superpowers. And we need to teach Putin and every other dictator that wars like this are not something that we want to see fought in this century.
That's Misha Zelinsky there talking about the Ukraine war. That's it for this episode of The Briefing. We'd love it if you could share this episode with someone who you think might enjoy it. And if you want to keep up with our other content, you can check us out on Instagram at The Briefing Podcast and on TikTok and YouTube. Just search Listener Newsroom. And we'll be back in your feeds tomorrow at 6 a.m. I'm Chris Spyrou. See you next time.